We're going to replace the rear wheel assembly for a 2010 Honda CR-V. Now this is different than the 2012 that I did. The process will be almost the same. Now we have a CV axle that goes through the center of this rear wheel assembly. Before I jack this up, I'm going to go ahead and loosen these, not fully, just enough to break them loose. I have a locking nut on this one. Let me get that in its proper position, and then we'll break those loose. So I'm using the jack that comes with the car just so that I can show how it needs to go under a specific place on the frame. Just make sure that's in the proper position. Then take your lug wrench and you can crank that up. So what can happen is, if you're on the road and you have to make a repair like this, if you're on an angle and that car rolls, it can come off the jack. So what I like to do is use the tire along with a block or a big piece of wood to prevent it from going all the way to the ground, because it'd be hard to get the jack in the proper position again. So I like to use blocks along with the tire that came on it to block it up to prevent that from happening. So this is my beach car, and you can see a lot of rust here on the rotor itself. I'm gonna squirt some WD-40, some Marvel Mystery Oil in here, possibly in here as well. We're gonna have to take that bend out of this nut so we can break it loose. But the first step is just let this set for a little bit and put something that can break up any kind of rust or corrosion so that these will be easier to break loose. Because I'm going to use an impact wrench, and I don't want to take the chance of twisting that out so that I have to drill those out and back them out with a bolt extractor. So before I do anything at all, I want to break up any deposits to make it as easy as possible to get these two screws out and also to be able to back that bolt off. So this bolt goes to the CV axle. We've got to take that dented part out so that we can unthread it. So we're going to put something in there and try to raise that up so that it'll unthread. That's just a safety mechanism so that it wouldn't come undone and have your whole hub come off of that CV axle. So you have an R and an L. That's going to be hard to see on camera. But a good way, just to check your work, is to push it down on the ground to see which way it's actually rotating, because you don't want to actually tighten it. So you want to push it on the ground and see, is it rotating the way I want it to rotate to loosen that. So lefty-loosey. All right, so I'm going to get over here, press that in. I know it's going the right way. I'm going to give it a couple little taps. There we go. And now it twists. So what I'm doing is slightly tapping it so it'll kind of sink in before it makes that twist, because I don't want it to spin the head of that Phillips off. And then once it's in there, then I give it a fairly good tap or two, and I try to hold it in place with my hand, and that's twisting just like you saw on the ground to loosen that up. I'm going to shake that loose before I undo it all the way. There we go. That bit out, just run that back in. So run it back down and then shake it loose here. You should be able to get it out. So both of those are ready to come out. One of my old screwdrivers that I really don't care about. So I can kind of bang on it. You see how that's getting larger? I want to make sure there's no divots in there so I don't get any extra resistance when I try to break this loose. I want to make it as right, it's unlikely that you're gonna get this off with an impact, a manual impact wrench. You're gonna need something with some power. So let's go ahead and, there we go. Pop that bad boy off. But you'll want an impact wrench instead of some sort of impact driver, because those are on really good. All right, so we're on the back side of this brake caliper. I'm gonna just loosen. So I don't want to undo those completely. Now, sometimes you're gonna need a crescent wrench or something to fit on there to keep that from rotating. This is good enough for right now. Let's just loosen those up. We're not gonna take those bolts all the way out. Go. All right, there's two 17s. There's one here, there's one here. Got to be careful of that brake line. We're gonna break this one loose first. So this thing is my beach car, so it's been out in the sand. This is gonna be hard to break loose, but you want to push it to the left, so lefty loosey. There we go. We're gonna break top one loose up here. This is going to allow us, once we get that off, to get that brake caliper off and get this brake line right here out of the way. There we go. Wrench here. Back those out. All right, good. We got that one off. Try to move this into a location where it's not going to get damaged. Let's move that out of the way. So we don't want it moving around. Once you get that brake caliper off, you can go ahead and take the disc off. You got to make sure that your emergency brake is off all the way. Get that to a point where we can use our socket on it. Right, that one's loose. All right, good. That one's loose enough now. All right, we're gonna knock this one out. So we'll loosen it up, and then we'll get it with our ratcheting driver. So we don't want to bust, or we don't want to damage the CV axle boot. It's got all the grease in it. We don't want to pinch it or anything, so be careful around that. We've got brake line here, and then we've got this boot here, so we've got to be careful around that. Let me see if I can get a 12mm bolt here that I'm going to undo to get this brake line out of the way, because I don't want to take the chance of pinching that and having to replace it. Go ahead, take that out real quick. So that's going to allow us to move that brake line. I'm going to go ahead and take that out, and then we can kind of position this to a safer location so that we can get that last 17mm bolt out. Move the brake lines to a safe position. It's also going to give us better access to those 17mm bolts that are on the back side of this assembly. So, all right in there, you should be able to see those 17mm bolts fairly well. We got one up here, one here, and then one over here. That's the one where we had to remove the brake line for fear of impacting that. Make sure it's turning the right way. Yeah, it is. So now let's see if we can get those out. That one feels like it's done there. That should be good. I think that one's good. got that one off. Here we're gonna have to kind of wiggle this thing, so we're going to wiggle it just a little bit if we want to take it back to the, I guess, 90s. Or was that 80s? There we go. It comes off pretty easy. So there's our hub assembly that we're replacing. Hopefully the noise is in there and not in the CV axle. In there. So this kind of feels gritty. Can't really hear it, but it does not want to freely rotate. That's a speed sensor. It tells how fast your tires are turning, or really that CV axle is turning. Look at all that dirt and sand that was in there. I'm gonna go ahead and take that out so I can just wipe it off and clean around this axle. Yeah, so we're gonna undo that speed sensor. You just follow that wire down right here. It's gonna be a 10. Come back to the front and it'll be out of the way. That's it right there. And we'll clean that out really good. CV axle back, just to kind of let it rest so we could get in there and clean all of that out. All right, before putting the hub assembly on, I put a little light grease in there, but I was careful not to get it on the speed sensor or on the area that the speed sensor reads. We're gonna put this hub assembly on, we'll put the bolts in place, and then we'll look up the torque specifications. Once we get all proper bolts in their locations, then we'll torque those down. Right now, I just want to line that up, slide it into place, and we'll take those 17mm bolts with the washers that we took off and put those in their location and run them down. Let's go ahead and get all of our bolts in the location and torque down. So we'll run these in by hand. You may have to shake that hub assembly on the front side just to kind of get them positioned until you feel them thread in. I'm not going to run them all the way down yet. So we're going righty-tighty. That one feels like it threaded down. Now we're going to run these down with the wrench, not tight. Let's go ahead, put that back in place. So the speed sensor goes in there. Lock it here. Just gonna run that down by hand. Make sure we don't get any cross threading. Right here you can see that speed sensor. That's the location. Now we got to torque these down to 73 foot-pounds. So these are going to be the 4 bolts that are holding the hub assembly on. We're going to have to torque it down too, and then we're also going to have to notch that bolt and notch it into place. We have to put the disc on first before we put the brake line back in place and then the brake caliper. We need to line up these screws with the lug bolt. So this one right here will allow us to use those screws to keep the hub in place. So we had to make sure those. All right, good. So we're gonna place that. It's got a little groove in it that it fits. And this was a 12 for the actual brake line. So let's try to thread it down by hand. And then once we get it into place, we'll tighten it down. So I took my pliers and I squeezed on the brake pad to press it back so that it would be easy to slide back in place on the disc. We can just line up that brake caliper, and we'll put that on, and then we'll take those 17mm bolts on the back side and run those in, and then we'll torque those down to spec here in just a second. All right, that one's good. So now we have a pivot point, and I'm going to do the same thing up here. Feel that one go in, do it by hand first. We're going to run these down, and then we'll torque them with the torque wrench. Let's just get them into position. We're going to torque these down to 80 foot-pounds. So let's get our torque wrench on there. There we go. We're going to have to put the tire back on, lower this down to actually safely torque down this axle bolt. And then we'll have to hammer it down to kind of lock it into place. All right, for the axle nut, we've got to go to 133 foot-pounds for the four-wheel drive model. So I put the spare on because it made getting to the axle nut easy. With the tire that I had on it, it's not going to be so easy to get to that axle nut. Let me make sure I've got this set right. Yeah, feels right. Almost there. There we go. Heard it pop. Now we're gonna stake this axle nut, and you want something that you can use like a punch, and I'm just going to hammer that down so that it doesn't come undone, that it doesn't shake loose. Even though we torqued it down to spec, we want to make sure it doesn't shake loose. Alright, so we'll put these lug nuts back on hand tight so we don't cross thread anything. Sure nothing. There we go. Before you go drive around, just to make sure that you've got pedal and then it's not going all the way down to the floorboard. Make sure you didn't lose any brake fluid, and then it's actually gripping that disc.